Okay, I've got a little bit after 4. So I think what we'll do is we'll get going. We've got a lot of material here, probably too much. What we'll do is, if I tend to go fairly quickly through some of the lead-up slides to the battle at the North Bridge, we will be putting the PowerPoint deck as well as the recording of this session on our website, which is actonhistoricalsociety.org. I'm Doug Herrick. I'm here with Bill Clower. We're from the Acton Historical Society, and we thought we'd do something a little different. It's a fairly controversial issue, even now, almost 250 years after the Battle of April 19th, 1775 at the North Bridge. The towns involved are still debating, and I'm still amazed to see articles pop up in local newspapers around Patriots Day talking about some of the issues. Bill was the one who first kind of tuned me into the idea, having been in Acton only about 8 years, that there has been a traditional history of healthy debate and controversy around both the events of the bridge, the performance of the different militias and Minutemen, and the outcomes, really. So, Bill, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Having grown up in this town, I was always told by Florence Merriam, my first grade teacher, that it was the Battle of Lexington, fought and conquered by Acton men. Well, it's always been very controversial, but there seems to be a fair amount of truth in it. And it seems also that in our youth, so much was just thought to be true, but more has been written about it over the years, and it seems to be somewhat more logical. So let's begin.
Okay. So basically what we'll be discussing, and I'll just back up for a second. We wanted to just kind of frame some of these issues and then talk a little bit about the history of the different militias and the minute companies leading up to the Revolutionary War. Understanding the role of these militias and their performance, I think, is really important to the debate. We also would like to just cover and level set everybody as to the various events that resulted, in the revolution, because they do affect this discussion. We'll go into the two main battles of April 19th, which is the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord and the North Bridge. We won't cover too much about the retreat of the British back to Boston. And then we'll talk about the various parties and debates and books and articles that really constitute, I think, that series of debates. So the three towns involved are Concord, Acton, and Lexington. They were all major parties to the battle at the North Bridge. There were many other militia from different towns involved, and we'll talk about them, but they were the ones that really helped define some of the topics. The big issue, I think, as defined by Concord, was who engaged in the first forcible resistance, organized and forcible resistance. The role of the Acton Minutemen was highly debated in terms of how they ended up, or whether they even ended up at the front of the line at the Battle of the North Bridge. Bill had talked to me a little bit about the fact that after the Revolutionary War, initially, there really wasn't a lot of discussion about it. Like all soldiers, who are fairly, limited in their interest in discussing these sorts of things, the real debates began in the 1820s, and they do continue today. And I think what we found was that because the colonial history and the legacy and the heritage for so many towns in eastern Massachusetts is based on the events around the Revolutionary War, it's very important to them, and a lot of their identity and even a sense of honor is tied up in different interpretations about what happened and why. There are many myths and many legends involved in this. The myth of the underdog, the myth of the farmer, citizen, soldier. And we'll talk about the militia because it turns out that they were fairly experienced and fairly professional. They weren't a lot of, like some people indicate, just kind of locals who picked up a gun and wandered off. So these were the towns. What I'll do is I'll show you, in terms of just to orient you, Boston is down here. When the British crossed over on April 18th, the evening of, they went to Lechmere Point in Cambridge, which is now Somerville, through Arlington, into Lexington. They cut through Lincoln and into Concord. And here's Acton. And a lot of the identities of many towns, as you know, in Eastern Massachusetts are based on separating from a larger town. So I grew up in Wenham, Massachusetts, which separated from Salem. I have no particular dog in this fight or controversy. I find it very interesting. Acton did break off from Concord and for a long time had a certain identity and a kinship with Concord. And Lexington broke off from Cambridge. So in terms of the militia model was inherited from England, where, from time immemorial, every male from 16 to 60 was required to participate. They were given weapons, usually just muskets. There was an alarm and muster system in which different alarms, usually 3 shots from a musket, in some cases drums, in some cases signal fires, called people to muster or to get together at a particular location. Massachusetts Bay was the first colony to form its militia into regiments by county. Usually a company of militia was the basic unit. It was about 40, I've heard 50 people, and about 10 companies constituted a regiment. And they were very involved initially during the settlement of North America with wars and conflicts with Native Americans, particularly the Pequot War in Connecticut and King Philip's War, which was a major conflict. Minutemen, the interesting thing about minute companies or Minutemen was that for many years, informally, the best, most athletic, young, best marksmen were often peeled off of the militia companies and formed into rapid response teams. It was only later that they were called Minutemen. After the closing of the port of Boston in 1774, the Mass Provisional Congress, which replaced the Massachusetts General Court, basically suggested or advised that about 10 or 15% of the militia companies would be formed into Minutemen, and they were clearly the elite. They had a culture of consensus and consultation. They elected their own captains. They often voted and decided what they would do and how they would do it. Some of the minute companies, including Acton, received bayonets, which were considered contraband as a military weapon. The British did not like the local militia having bayonets. This was their method. In addition, there were militia alarm companies. These were either reserves, but they were mainly men over the age of 60 that would do guard duty, reconnaissance, and young boys would often be dispatch riders and alarm riders. The French and Indian Wars, in addition to giving a lot of experience to the militia, this was the first time that they were actually asked to volunteer to form companies and to fight alongside the British under British officers. And this came about, obviously, as an extension of the war in Europe. The 7 Years' War did start in the US in 1754 and then spread to pretty much a world war involving, Prussia, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, even Russia. And this gave an awful lot of experience to the local militia. Acton in particular sent 5 men to the eastern frontier, which was what they called Maine. They also were involved in the Battle of Crown Point, which is along Lake Champlain in New York State. They were involved in the capture of Louisbourg, which was the French fortress at the end of Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, as well as Quebec. So they came back to their militias in Acton and in New England pretty experienced. The French and Indian Wars also really started, I think, many of the events that led up to the Revolution, in the sense that the British had an awful lot of debt. And up to this point, they had not really enforced a lot of their tariff-based laws, the navigation laws that said, only British ships, could be used for goods and services, as well as the Sugar Act. Actually, that was the Molasses Act that put a duty on molasses and sugar from, if everyone could mute themselves, that would be great. Coming up from the Caribbean colonies of France.
I think pretty much.
I'm going to have to mute everyone if okay. So what happened was, as you know from, your high school history, the various acts resulted in a sense of taxation without representation. What had been pretty much ignored in terms of smuggling along the long Atlantic coast was now, I think, was enforced with an awful lot of seriousness, and as a result, a variety of events, such as we'll see, the boycott of British goods, various imports, duties occurred, and it eventually moved towards various insurrection and other activities that resulted in the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, the reaction to that was the Intolerable Acts, or what the British called the Coercive Acts, which pretty much shut down local government in Massachusetts and singled out Massachusetts really for punishment, as an example, given the trend of rebellion that was developing in the colonies. So when Thomas Gage, the military governor, shut down the port of Boston, moved the capital to Salem, that was a very severe, essentially the beginning of war. At that point, the Mass Provincial Congress was formed. It was seated in Concord because Concord was away from the coast. The British, as a naval power, pretty much controlled the coast. And so they needed to have, the security of an inland town like Concord. The various companies of the King's Militia became the colonial militia. They did this by essentially asking everyone to resign, and only the patriot leaders or captains were voted in. And they immediately started raiding the various points where they would store gunpowder and armories and try to essentially take back what they needed for military stores. And it was in November of 1774 that the Acton Minutemen under Isaac Davis were formed. If anyone has heard about the big powder alarm, it was a very interesting attempt by the British to essentially grab the gunpowder as well as a couple cannon on Cambridge Common. If you've ever been to Somerville near Tufts University, this building still stands. It was originally, I think, a windmill, and it became the storage area for both the militia, the colonial militia, as well as the King's powder. So the British decided to essentially take it. They went up the Mystic River one morning in September 1st. They had trouble finding the key, but they eventually got in and went off with it. This was interesting because it really created a major American response with militias and Minutemen from all over the eastern part of Massachusetts converging on Cambridge. There were a lot of rumors about massacres, which never occurred, but it certainly gave the British pause about what they would expect the next time they went back into, the parts of Massachusetts away from the Boston coast. So these were the local militia companies in 1775. I'll give you a quick chance to take a look at them. The ones we'll be talking about are really the Concord militia, as well as the two Acton militia. These were the local minute companies, also in 1775. So we get into the march to Concord and the beginning of the fight. At this point, Bill, is there anything you'd like to add, jump in on?
No, I think you're doing actually a real good job on the thing. I might just slow it down.
Okay.
So let's go ahead, Doug.
Okay, will do. So around 10:30 p.m., as you know, we've all learned, by sea, essentially across the Charles River, the British, they had about 10 companies of light infantry and 11 companies of grenadiers, which were their kind of large shock troops doing most of the fighting. The light infantry tended to be skirmishers and flankers. They set across to Lechmere Point. They didn't get going until about 2 in the morning. And at that point, as we all know, Paul Revere, William Dawes were dispatched to Lexington to warn John Hancock and Sam Adams, who were there at the time. The British really had two goals. One was to arrest them. They were the Sons of Liberty leaders that they wanted to arrest. And they also wanted to proceed to Concord to find, whatever military supplies, cannon, powder balls that they could get. So at this point, Dawes and Hancock got to, Dawes and Revere got to Lexington around midnight, ahead of the British considerably, and Captain John Parker of the militia, that was a mistake. They weren't Minutemen, they were militia, assembled his troops. They had to wait a while, and I think what happened was they then dispersed at a certain point. It was very cold, and then they were called back later when the British appeared. Revere and Dawes continued on to Concord. On the way, they ran into Samuel Prescott, who was another Son of Liberty. And it was fortunate that they ran into him. He was apparently visiting his fiancée in Lexington. And they went off together. They ran into a British patrol. Revere was taken prisoner. Dawes and Prescott escaped. Prescott continued on to Concord. Dawes went back to Lexington. And it was Prescott that continued on to Concord and then to Acton to warn everyone. So Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about how Acton was essentially alerted?
Yeah, Acton was alerted when we don't positively know that for sure, but it was alleged that it was Prescott that arrived at the home of Joseph Robbins over on Concord Road, banged on the house and told him, Captain Robbins, the regulars are coming. That said, his son, who had been 13 years old, left the house on their horse and went over to Davis's house and let Captain Davis know. The unknown rider then proceeded over to South Acton to the home of Faulkner, and the alarm was given from there as well, which was 3 shots, as Doug said. And we don't know what exact time this was because nobody really at that point in time noted everything that was going on. From then on, the men formed at Davis's house about sunrise and proceeded down to Concord, or what we today call the Isaac Davis Trail, but back in those days it was the main drag from Acton down to Concord. This road was abandoned about 1808 when the town was relaid out, but it's still out there today. That's the one that we're going to follow. We are not going to follow the other 2 groups, although they may have taken much the same route. There's been more effort put into the events of the Minutemen than of the 2 militia companies. Okay, Doug. Davis's house still stands today in West Acton. We think that it's pretty much the same house. And there is a stone that was put out front of it to commemorate it. That's his birthplace. His main house was changed or burned in the 1850s. In the 1870s, Daniel Chester French took the plow that was Davis's, along with what people remembered for features of Isaac Davis, and created the statue down at the North Bridge. There's a couple of other things that still exist. The powder horn was the one that was Hosmer was carrying, and the underneath the, let's see, the sword that was Isaac Davis's, by the way, was returned to the town of Acton in 1957. When he fell at the bridge, he landed on it, breaking the thing, and it's been reduced in length. Also, the cartridge box to the left in this picture has survived. It's probably typical of the type of boxes that they carried. Shot, by the way, was created up what they call shot towers. And that thing that Doug showed earlier could have been a shot tower. What they did was to drop lead, molten lead from a height, and land in it. When it landed in water, it would be round. Next one.
Yeah. So the point here with this was that most people carried a powder horn, obviously, for gunpowder, and they would carry a sack of the lead balls. And it was more efficient, instead of pouring in, the gunpowder and then ramming the shot down, to pre-roll a cartridge with paper, so that all you had to do was to essentially bite off the top, pour, the gunpowder down the muzzle of the musket, and then put the ball in and tamp it down. It was a more efficient way. You could get more shots off. And this was an example of a local bayonet that Isaac Davis actually, as a blacksmith, created and formed for his troops.
In the late 1890s, when the library was created, this painting of Davis and his men for the departure of Acton's Minutemen was painted by Acton artist, no relation whatsoever of Davis's, but nevertheless, this gentleman had created a couple of other paintings along the same line, and we think that it pretty much is the way that things looked back at that period of time. We do not really know that they were in such a close column, because although they went down at daybreak, we do not know. There are many English sympathizers that were in the area, and they could easily have been fired upon. We do know that they did not avail themselves to what do I want to call protecting the companies. And if you look at the pictures here, the Acton guys probably, as a militia outfit, would not dress this well.
Yeah. I thought what I'd do is everyone had at least a fifer and a drummer. And the White Cockade is a great kind of signature tune of the Revolutionary Minutemen, because it was used by Bonnie Prince Charlie in his revolt in Scotland in the early 1700s. And I'm trying to see if I can get this. Okay. Hopefully this will stop in a minute. Okay, so anyway, continuing back to the British for a second, they were marching towards Lexington when Captain John Parker, who was a veteran of the French and Indian Wars, he had participated in the Battle of Quebec and Louisbourg, lined his men up along Lexington Green. His orders were to stand your ground. He didn't intend to fight. At that point, everyone was still considered British, and there was a concern that if they fired, they'd be considered, guilty of treason. Up to this point also, the British had marched through the various towns of Arlington and not done anything. So there was really no concern. However, Pitcairn, the major who was in charge of the light infantry, took exception to their presence and told them to lay down their arms and disperse. At that point, Parker told his troops to basically disperse, but they took their muskets with them. And that upset Pitcairn, who again told them to lay down their arms. No one seems to know who fired the first shot. It wasn't apparently from the militia there or from the British. It could have been somebody, there was a lot of people hanging around with guns. But the British then considered that a hostile act and opened fire, killing 8 and wounding 10. It's not clear if any of the Americans fought back or shot back. So that really was the end of the Battle of Lexington. The British at that point lost control of their troops, who were essentially chasing the Americans into houses, and it was only when the Maine Grenadiers showed up with Lieutenant Colonel Smith that they pulled them back and then marched to Concord. I'm showing this map because I think it gives a good sense of the geography of Concord, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened. But this road to Lexington here, from Lexington, was where the British came into the town of Concord. The colonials basically went out to meet them, saw that they were outnumbered, essentially moved to this high ground here, these hills around this corner here where I think the graveyard, the cemetery is now. This is Monument Street. This is where the British ultimately, after looking for supplies in Concord, went up over the Old North Bridge and over to Colonel Barrett's house, which they believed had certain cannon as well as other supplies. So this is kind of the geography of it. This was the Assabet River. Here's the Sudbury River forming the Concord River off to Lowell. And this is the Old North Bridge. This was the side that the British ended up on. And as the Americans retreated back over these high grounds, they were on a large hill called Punkatossett Hill up here. And this is where they assembled until they came down to this high ground here and eventually marched off to the bridge. So, Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about the Isaac Davis Trail? Because they eventually, this is Barrett's Mill Road here. This is how they eventually made their way to Concord.
Barrett's Mill Road still has the Barrett House is still standing today, but as the Acton Militia were headed, or Acton Minutemen, I mean, were headed to Concord, they could tell that that there was activity over at the Barrett's Mill farm. For that reason, they exited to the left and went up behind what is the mill dam for Barrett's Mill. That was still standing, by the way, when I was a kid, but it's since fallen into ruin. They managed to lay low and not get detected. They continued along Barrett's Mill, crossing over, and eventually if you go down, I believe it's called Balls Hill Road, a little bit further, you can take a right and come right up on the backside of the hill. And I believe that's, from what we know, that's the route that the Acton men took that day. So upon their arrival, they all find that there are other companies that have assembled, and they took their stand after checking in to see what's going on. And this is where it went from there. The hill by this is still vacant, at least the last I knew. And it is sort of still a mustering point on April 19th.
Right.
Over the years, the Barretts managed to build a fairly substantial mansion there that's now the home for the park. But anyway, if you go down and look at the configuration of things, you find that the road goes down along the edge of the water and crosses over the bridge. It crosses over the bridge on the right-hand corner on the low side of it, but nevertheless, it figures into the story.
Right. So previously, just a few months before the Battle of April 19th, the various militia and Minutemen had mustered in this area before. And they had taken up various positions with the Acton Minutemen and Militia on the left. And so when they formed again for this battle, they took the same positions that they had taken back at that muster before, the war. So the British arrive. They start looking, within the homes of Concord for arms. As Bill said, back then, I would say, maybe 50-50 were loyalists versus patriots. And, a lot of spies and loyalists had been watching where the arms had been stored and tipped off the British. The British searched the town. They found certain cannon. They broke off the truncheons, so that they couldn't be mounted on the carriages. They started burning the carriages and throwing anything that they had found into the river. And of course, the British officers headed to the taverns while the grenadiers did all the work. The fires seen from Punkatossett Hill were interpreted as the British burning Concord. At that point, Colonel Barrett, who was in charge, decided to move down to the lower hill and assemble everybody for the march to the bridge. At that point, the Acton militia were invited to essentially lead, because Captain David Brown of Concord, when asked, since they were on Concord, if he would like to take the lead, said that he would rather not. And at that point, the famous statement by Isaac Davis, when he was offered if he wanted to lead, said something to the effect of, "Are you afraid to go?" And, "No, I am not. There isn't a man in my company that is," or, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go." And at that point, they essentially advanced down towards the bridge. The British started tearing up planks on the bridge to prevent the Americans from coming over. They told them to desist, and that was the beginning of the confrontation. So you had basically the Acton Minutemen under Isaac Davis, with Major Buttrick up front. As they advanced, there were some scattered shots that were hitting the water. The Americans were a little surprised that the British were actually shooting ball, as they said. At that point, the Acton fifer, Luther Blanchard, was wounded, and they realized this was for real. The Americans fired a volley. The British responded. At that point, Captain Davis and Private Abner Hosmer were killed. There was a series of additional firing, at which point the British retreated back to Concord, leaving 3 dead and 1 wounded. And that was really the end of that fight, because the Americans, especially the Acton militia and Minutemen, were very much taken aback by the fact that their captain had been shot and didn't advance any further. Bill, you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. After the skirmish, the 2 bodies of Hosmer and Davis were taken back to Davis's house on Hayward Road. And a little later in the morning, there was a 3rd event that happened, and that was down at Fisk's Hill, which is down closer to Route 128. At that point, Hayward, who was a school teacher, and he had trained with the company, but was not part of the Minutemen, as he had severed some of his toes, said to the British regular, "You are a dead man." And the reply came back, "So are you." And they both fired simultaneously. It turns out that good old Haywood was a pretty good shot and killed the British guy instantly, but Haywood did not die till later in the day. So that basically was accounted for the third person who was killed down in two killed in Concord, one in Lexington, and the their remains were all brought back to Acton and later buried. Those are the three that are in the monument, base of the monument in Acton Center.
Right. So basically, that was the end of the Minutemen. Once the war started, they were integrated into the Continental Army. You know, for all of the talk of the Minutemen, they only were around for about 6 months. But that group later became the Davis Blues in the War of 1812, the Davis Guards that eventually fought in the Civil War. And but during the Revolutionary War, many of the militia and Minutemen ended up being essentially garrisoning the forts that surrounded Boston when the British were still there. And they fought later also in the battles of Long Island and White Plains. So now we get to the debate part.
Actually, Doug, I got one more bit of trivia.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a pair of brothers, Calvin and Luther Blanchard. They grew up in what's now Boxborough, but they were apprentices to Abner Hosmer and were present that day as well. One of them was, as stated earlier, was wounded in the first volley that went through, and he continued to serve. He did die at the Battle of Breeds Hill later on, and we don't know exactly where he is buried. A monument to him is up in the town of Littleton, but he is another casualty of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. So as we had mentioned and Bill had said, not a lot of activity in terms of debating what happened occurred, you know, for about 50 years or so. And during the visit of General Lafayette, who supported the Americans and was instrumental in getting French support during the Revolution, visited the United States, traveled all over, and stopped in Concord in 1824. And a state senator, Samuel Hoar, said that where the general was standing in Concord was the very spot where the first forcible resistance was raised against the British crown. Clearly, the folks in Lexington took exception to that. And both towns started, you know, in the method of the time, collecting depositions from the survivors who were in their 80s in many cases. And Elias Finney of Lexington published his History of the Battle of Lexington. And Finney basically made several points: that first blood was shed in Lexington, that it was the place where the Revolutionary War commenced, and it was the first standard of an armed opposition. And in the sense that they stood armed, you know, opposing. But Concord, not to be, you know, outdone, in the form of Reverend Ezra Ripley, who lived near the Old Manse, which is a little bit south of the bridge, wrote a pamphlet called The History of the Fight at Concord, and claimed that it was Concord who offered the first forcible resistance, because essentially the British created what was essentially a massacre in Lexington, but the Americans did not shoot back. The British fired first, whereas at the Battle of Concord, the Americans fired first. So once again, the sense of honor, the sense of history, you know, the bragging rights continued. So Lexington's position was, it started there. Up to that point, as they had marched through the different towns, no American town other than Lexington had, you know, formed resistance. And the presence of Captain Parker's militia was really the first forcible resistance. And the question became, who wounded the one British soldier who was wounded? Was it a soldier, a militia member, or an armed bystander? Never been resolved who did that. In 1835, Lemuel Shattuck, who was a well-known, respected local citizen, published his history of the town of Concord, and he kind of went after Acton and Isaac Davis. And his position was that Isaac Davis's Minutemen company, without orders, marched past the Concord company, which had been at the head of the column because, you know, they had the rights by virtue of the fact that it was in Concord, without orders, ignoring the fact from other historians that said he was asked to go, he consented, and then took his position at the head of the column on the right. So according to Shattuck, the Acton and the Concord companies ended up together equally in front. There were other aspects of his history of the town of Acton that did not go over terribly well. His statement that since the history of the town of Acton in 1735 in its formation, since then, up until the Revolution, it contained no features worthy of particular notice. And the town, since the Revolution, is of very little general interest. So that certainly started off the reaction in Acton, both in terms of disparaging the efforts of Isaac Davis, who had grown in reputation given his personality and the fact that he was a martyr. And so Reverend Josiah Adams, who had been born in Acton, he was also a prominent citizen, really led the charge against Shattuck and his book. So it was an interesting debate because in 1775, Acton residents still felt very strong kinship with Concord and felt a part of them. But Acton clearly needed to respond. In addition, Ezra Ripley, in his book, had said that Captain Davis of Acton arrived, brought on his company, and passing the other companies, took the right of the whole, the right position, which placed him nearest to the bridge, implying that, again, he had not been authorized to go to the front, but he had just marched past everyone towards the enemy, and by virtue of being on the right, just happened to be in front. So in Acton's Centennial Celebration, 1835, Josiah Adams gave a long speech, several hours, replying to both Ripley and Shattuck about Isaac Davis and his performance on that day. Again, depositions now started with the remaining Minutemen from Acton. He was able to get 3 depositions from 2 of the fighters, as well as Isaac Davis's widow. So in 1836, a year later, at the dedication of the North Bridge Monument, and Bill pointed out that this was erroneously placed where the British were, not on the American side of the river, but on the British side. He read his poem, Concord Hymn, that everyone knows, you know, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. So again, it started up, and how do you respond to a guy like Ralph Waldo Emerson? So again, it just continued. On the 75th anniversary of the fight, they decided to hold a big event in 1850, and basically this was the beginning of Lexington holding separate events from Concord. Everyone attended. There was a huge dinner. Everyone played the White Cockade song. And at that point, the movement to begin the Isaac Davis Monument in Acton Center began. I'll let Bill take over from there.
Okay. Yeah. The beginning of that goes back to a man by the name of the Reverend Trask Woodbury, who was the minister of the Acton Center Congregational Evangelical Church. Woodbury lived over on Woodbury Lane in the Gardner House, still standing, and took the position that Acton needs to do something. Well, Acton raised money for the building of the monument. There was a movement through the legislature to appropriate money for the construction. And it's sort of an interesting thing to find out that the granite for this obelisk came off of Woodbury's property. It is 75 foot tall from the bottom up to the beginning of the flagpole. The flagpole is 25 feet high, and surprisingly, so the whole thing is a total of 100 feet in height. Over the years, it has been damaged by wind, and in 1863, an American eagle landed on the pole. So during the Civil War. But nevertheless, let's talk about the events of 1851 when the monument was completed. They had a celebration and sort of a macabre type thing where they went over to the cemetery. They dug up the bones of Haywood, Davis, and Hosmer and put them all in a good-sized casket, separated and with glass over the top. It was on display in front of the monument for a day or so, and then buried in the base of the monument where it is today. So that was the beginnings of Acton's Revolutionary War monument. Over the years, the land has become far more consecrated. A couple of cannon were added back about 100 years ago, and it's taken on the site of the way it looks now. The headstones of Hosmer, Haywood, and Davis line three sides of the base of the monument on the curvature of the hill, and the fourth side is the stone that Isaac Davis fell on, which you will see depicted in the middle left top. That was presented back to the town of Acton and placed on the north side. So the whole thing today is pretty much a monument to these three men and the events of April 19th.
Okay, so I'll quickly get through the rest of these. The Centennial was the big celebration. This is when Concord started making up with Acton. They were very gracious. They talked about the fact that Isaac Davis was genuinely the martyr. He was up front. It was also something of a disaster in the sense that too many people showed up. People overwhelmed the place where they were having the lunch, and it became, almost like a riot. But most of the federal government was there. President Grant was there, his Secretary of State and Treasury, and everyone was there. Then later on the 125th anniversary in 1900, the Minuteman sculpture in Lexington Green, depicting Captain John Parker was erected. And that was in the same area where their war monument had been essentially consecrated in 1799, which was the first of the Revolutionary War monuments. And again, they disinterred 7 of their 8 militia members who were killed and reinterred them within the fence down there you can see of that monument. Finally, in 1925, there was an interesting speech at the 150th anniversary by Mayor, the beloved Honey Fitzgerald, Mayor of Boston, in which he said that men, not places, count. Again, extending the debate on, is it the geographical location of a battle, or is it the people that fought in the battle? So that is pretty much the presentation. You're